So much of our experience in life can be so very random. In 2016, my wife and I did a trip down to Yellowstone Park, wildlife capital of North America. And one of the things I hope we could do is find some antelope, because my wife had never seen an antelope in the live. And so we were there for 4 days. We did everything we could to track these critters down and had no luck at all. And so we thought we were skunked by this until halfway home, a whole herd of them walked across the road in front of us in the car. So sometimes what we face can be incredibly random like that. But other times things are not so random. And a question I think we as Christians ask ourselves every so often is, are some of the things that happen in the life of our own lives or in the life of our church a consequence of God touching our situation? And in our Reformed theological tradition, we would say, yes, that can happen. And so the basic point I want to drive home tonight is for us to reflect on how this may be true, actually, in the current reality that so many people are concerned about in the life of their community of faith, their church. So many are worried about their congregation's future. And we see how the shape of Canada is shifting and changing. And as all this happens, it makes me wonder, is this a time when God is directly or indirectly challenging the church to rethink our very nature? And to help us do that kind of reflection, I'd like us to think about the story of Jonah. And I think this is a very helpful story for today. My first university degree was in marine biology. So based on that, I'm pretty sure that the story of Jonah is not a true historic story. As a marine biologist, I could say blue whale is the largest whale in the ocean, 3-chambered stomach. The largest of those stomachs I could barely stand up in, but I could only do so by scrunching down. And I would die of, if I was in the stomach, I would die of methane poisoning within a few minutes. A little fun fact, whales are very flatulent. So, and then once I died from methane, I would be digested. So the book of Jonah is a whale of a tale that speaks to God being on God's mission in the world. And we call this the Missio Dei, the mission of God. And God's mission has been the same throughout history, to help the world grow in knowing God and to help us grow in loving our neighbor. And one strategy that God used to affect this, to pursue this mission, was the creation of one nation, Israel, that would show the world how to do that. And in Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham to be the father of this nation, Israel, and declares to Abraham that this people will be blessed in order to be a blessing to all nations. So in our story of Jonah, we hear that the Missio Dei is being focused in this moment on converting the Assyrians, and starting with the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. And that's located today in northern Iraq. Now, the conversion of the Assyrians in Nineveh was no small project. At the time, Nineveh was one of the largest cities in the world, 120,000 people, controlled a huge empire, and it controlled it through great brutality. And so we enter the story here. at the beginning, chapter 1, and reading from the Message version because it's nice and punchy. It says, one day long ago, God's word came to Jonah, Amittai's son. And he says, up on your feet and on your way to the big city of Nineveh, preach to them. They're in a bad way, and I can't ignore it any longer. But Jonah got up and went in the other direction to Tarshish, running away from God. And as you can see from the map, Tarshish is the exact wrong direction. And in the world of Jonah, that was the very edge of the known world. The story goes on. He went down to the port of Joppa, found a ship headed to Tarshish. He paid his fare, went on board with those going to Tarshish, far away from God as he could get. But God sent a huge storm, a sea with towering waves. And then the ship was about to break into pieces, and the sailors were terrified. And they called out in desperation to their gods, and they threw everything they were carrying overboard to lighten the ship. Meanwhile, Jonah had gone down into the hold to take a nap. He was sound asleep, and the captain came to him and said, what is this? Sleeping? Get up, pray to your God. Maybe your God will see that we are in trouble and will come to rescue us. And the sailors said to one another, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's draw straws to identify the culprit on the ship who's responsible for this disaster. So they drew straws, and Jonah drew the short straw. And then they grilled him. Confess, why this disaster? What is your work? Where'd you come from? What country? Who's your family? And he told them, I am a Hebrew. I worship God, the God of heaven who made sea and land. And at that, all the men were frightened, really frightened. And they said, what on earth have you done? And as Jonah talked, the sailors realized that he was running away from God. Now, in this opening chapter, we don't hear why Jonah was running away. But if we zip on down to the last chapter, after the Ninevites convert, we get Jonah's reason, and it's put very well in the Message translation. Chapter 4, Jonah was furious. He lost his temper, and he yelled at God, God, I knew it. I knew this was going to happen. That's why I ran off to Tarshish. I knew you were sheer grace and mercy, not easily angered, rich in love, and ready at a drop of a hat to turn your plans for punishment into a program for forgiveness. See, the Jews really, really hated the Assyrians. And what Jonah wanted was punishment for the Assyrians. Now, to understand that, in 722 BC, Assyria obliterated the northern kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah became a vassal state, and thus it would remain a vassal state for 100 years. So they were hate-worthy. But God, in the Missio Dei, wanted to see the most hated country in the world from the point of view of the Israelites, wanted to see them convert and to come to love and honor God and to change their behavior, becoming less exploitive and abusing. And we can imagine the Jewish listeners of this parable really capturing this sense, because as listeners, they would have really had the hate on for the Assyrians. So as this parable, the book is intended as an astonishing, shocking reminder to the people of Judah that they were God's strategy, that they were called to repair the world. The Jews say Tikkun Olam, repair of the world, to be a blessing to all nations, even a nation as bad as Assyria. And for many Jews today, this idea of Tikkun Olam, that they are people, their calling is to repair the world, and their calling is to be this illustration to the world of how to live with God. That is still very much their sense of purpose as the people of God. Now, in this story, a strategy God has decided to use to pursue the overall mission of Missio Dei is to have Jonah go to Nineveh and preach. And in chapter 1, we hear the word of the Lord come to Jonah. Go at once to Nineveh, the great city, cry out against it, for their wickedness has come to be known to me. Jonah, in response, tried to avoid God's calling. In fact, Jonah decided it would actually be better to die by drowning than to do what God would have him do. God, however, was not content with Jonah's response. God had a mission to see that the Ninevites would come to know God and change their brutal ways. And God had a strategy to make that happen. Send Jonah with a message. So rather than let Jonah drown, God put Jonah on a time out, an enforced period of reflection. And one can imagine that there's not an awful lot to do sitting in the belly of a whale in the dark for 3 days, other than to think about your situation in the whale and to think about what God would have you do. It was a belly of the whale time for Jonah. I have a great conviction that we're living in a belly of the whale time for us, the church, today. And God is now nudging us to reflect on God's Missio Dei, the mission of God, on the church's calling to be a strategy that God is using to fulfill God's mission, and to reflect on how we are doing and responding to that call. And so the question for me is, like, are we in our own time out now to reflect on getting back on board with God's mission? So I believe this is a time to rethink church. Now, I'm not alone in this. This is the consensus view of us, observers of the church in North America. And the consensus view is that this is currently a transitional time between how the church has been and how the church will be in the future. And why can't we stay the same? Well, let's take a look at some of the ways that we've experienced change in the church and in society in over the last generation or two. In 1946, the Gallup organization in the States, they did a poll in Canada, and they asked in the poll, did you attend public worship in the last 7 days? And the answer in 1946 was 67% said yes. Now, the Angus Reid company, polling company, they've asked the same question in December 2013. Did you attend public worship in the past 7 days? And the number of people saying yes was 13%. This represents an 80% drop in worship attendance. Why is this happening? Very simply, point one, we are losing our own people of faith, people of the church, and we are losing them at an increasing rate. Let's think about people who identify as Christian and identify as a mainline Christian. So these are people who say, I am a United Church person, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, an Anglican, and I'm a Christian. And when they were surveyed in 1996, how often do you attend religious services in the past 12 months? These people who said, I'm a Christian, I'm a Presbyterian, an Anglican, United Church, their responses were, 1/4 said, I never go to church, even though they identify as like Presbyterian Christians. 23% once a weekly, 20%. And then Angus Reid asked the same question again in 2013. See how the difference has happened here. Note that this is still people who say, I am a Christian, I am a Presbyterian, or I am a Lutheran or Anglican. And even though they say that about themselves, 52% now say they never ever go to church, even though they still think of themselves this way. 8% now once per month, and the number going weekly declined by half to 10%. Now, I said all that. Okay, so have you noticed worship decline in your own congregation over the last 10, 20, 40 years? I suspect you have. It's a pretty common across the board. There's a substantial growing number of people who identify as mainline Christians who are simply choosing to attend less or to attend not at all. They are dropping out of church. Real quick, 3 reasons. Participation in church is no longer meaningful for them. Second, the church has not done sufficient work to help people build a personal faith that can sustain the effects of living in a secular culture. The third group are what's called the dones, D-O-N-S, those who are done with church. They've simply had it with their church involvement. And this isn't news. We see it in our congregations. We've seen it starting with my own generation. I was born in 1957 at the very top of the baby boom in Canada. And starting with my generation and then going on down. That this has been our experience. A question I often ask when I'm doing this in a live in a room is ask people to raise their hand if they have children who grew up in the church, but who no longer participate in church. And the large majority of people in the room will put their hands up. I ask them to keep it held up and just to look around the room and to help people appreciate that, it's not something specifically that this set of parents did that affected that result with their kids. But we are talking about a big societal trend that affects the majority of families in churches, period, specific mainline churches. Now, I just wanted to stop sharing here for a moment and just ask if there's any, comments or questions at that point.
I have a question.
Rebecca, sure.
Do you know if there's been any major polls as to asking why people stop, like getting their specific reasons, like say that generation of children of why they stopped attending church, just to get drill down into it a little bit,
Sure.
To see if you can offer something that maybe they're saying they're not getting or.
Yeah. So I think if I can remember them all, there are four main reasons. In Canada, the latest book on this, do an advertisement for Joel Thiessen, Canadian sociologist in Calgary here. If you've heard the name Reginald Bibby, as a sociologist studying church for decades, Joel Thiessen's the next one. And if I can recall, there's four major ones in Canada. Simply the pressure of living in a society that is secular is, the way I phrase it, it's a caustic relationship. And it's slowly, living in our secular society slowly erodes the Christian faith. It's one thing if you want to, in a society where the large majority of people are Christian, it can be hard to opt out because everyone else is still opted in. And with 1/3 of the population of Canada now claiming to have no religion, you have a greater permission by the society to not have a religion. People can look at those who are secular and say they live meaningful lives, and so I don't really need to have religion to give me meaning in my life. Individualism means that we are making our own choices on what is meaningful and making it specifically pointed to me. And another one is that people can just simply have rational problems with things that are believed by Christians. And so those are a few. I'll be highlighting a few more a little later in their attitudes of the millennials in particular, but those are a few. The second point about why we're in the situation we are, and this is the second of 2 points I'm going to make, is, and we don't frame it this way, but it's so important to understand it this way. But society is no longer our partner in fostering and sustaining the Christian faith. It's very dramatic, the change that we've seen in our society, but we can see how, from the Statistics Canada data, how things have evolved in our society becoming more secular. And you can see the percentages running down the screen to now at 1/3 of Canadians claim to have no religion. The United States used to be way behind us on this, but they have actually rapidly caught up in the last decade. And so in the States now as well, 1/3 of the population claims to have no religion. So this is the group that sociologists call the nuns, not the ones that wear habits, but the ones that have no religion, none. And the sociologists are calling a group who were involved in the church but no longer, did hold a Christian faith but no longer. They call them nunverts. Converts take you from no religion into Christianity. Nunverts are those who leave Christianity and go to no religion. So nunverts. So there's the group that leaves church. We're losing our own, but also the growing number of people who have grown up and never had any religious background. And so substantially with like Gen X population and then down, that's more and more the case. One illustration in this that I think is helpful, sociologist Reg Bibby in 2008, surveying Canadian teenagers, found that in 2008, 47% of Canadian teenagers claimed that they had never attended a worship service ever in their life of any religion and that includes weddings and funerals. And so half of Canadian teenagers, no connection at all in their life in 2008. And today, those are millennials. So what has changed? This is what public school looked like when I was a kid. And I suspect there's some people sitting in their homes right now who can look at this picture and say, yeah, that was public school for me. We had, when I was growing up, public school started with the Lord's Prayer and a reading from the Bible daily. Sundays the stores were closed on Sundays out of respect. A civic event often started with a mainline minister, usually showing up with a preaching robe, saying a prayer. Meetings of elected bodies were open with Christian prayer. The minister of my church in 1970, he had a half-hour radio show on the local radio station. These things helped hold this kind of marriage between church and society, reinforcing each other, so that the Christian faith would be formed in people and maintained in people. And so as these things, which were part of the time of my youth, started to fall away, then it has started to have a negative impact on the church. When I was in grade 9, we stopped prayer in church, in public school. 1991, shopping on Sunday was opened up in Ontario. So society has been shifting, and we're only now really appreciating how much society was the church's partner in helping form Christian faith and help people maintain a Christian faith. And that just doesn't happen anymore. And as the consequence, it is Christianity's in decline. So I'll just kind of lean over. So like for the emerging generation, some of the things that they think about Christianity. First, they don't know what goes on in churches at all. They have very vague notions about Jesus. A very strong belief in Canada that religion has been bad for the world, with the specific examples of sexual abuse that's happened by church leaders, residential school experience in Canada. The belief that what we hold is not the truth. Truth is now relative to everyone who, to choose what they're going to believe. Very, very strong belief that if one was to become a Christian or become a part of a church, it will limit my freedom because I will have to live my life and believe things in specific ways. And that is an immense barrier for young people being involved in church today. Lots of young people interested in spiritual things. The last place they say they would look for help in any spiritual matter is the church. And today, the emerging generation, like with Gen X especially, and moving down, more prominent as you get younger, is people become what sociologists call spiritual tinkers. And they just take little bits from here and there, and they cobble it together to form their own sense of spirituality that works for them today. And as they live their life, they'll let go of things that don't work. They'll take up something new that does work, and they'll continue to massage it throughout their lives. And so the idea of, being a part of a group that has, a fixed boxed sense of spirituality in their mind is not at all appealing, because their practice is just to take a little bit from here and there. The last thing I want to say on this is just that just to help us understand really how fast this has changed. My parents' generation went to church because it was assumed that everybody was going to go to church. My generation, the boomers, we went to church school and then substantially as adults dropped out of church involvement. My kids' generation generally never even went to church school. That's how fast it's happened in the 3 generations that we've got living right now. And so growing secularization is the result of people dropping their sense that I am a Christian, who were involved in church, no longer are. And then a growing number of people who've had no connection with the Christian faith at all. Thus, that group called the nuns expands. Now, here I'm going to rely on our able moderator and host here to field questions. I don't want to close this down. I can't see you, but I don't want to close this down and then have to scroll back to, halfway through my PowerPoint.
Folks, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Peter, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the last chart. If you could just go back one to where you had all the numbers every decade. One more.
Yep.
Yeah. So what I'm interested in is what impact immigration has had on those numbers. My sense is that immigrants may have a higher level of religious affiliation than the old time population in Canada, and therefore that these numbers are actually worse in terms of our original population than what they would appear to be.
So there's maybe 3 or 4 answers to that. What your sense is certainly part of what's happening, because we do have a large number of people who are coming as immigrants who bring the Christian faith with them or bring another religion with them. And so they count here. The Roman Catholics have been doing pretty well in Canada, holding their own. And that's because we're getting a lot of immigration out of places like the Philippines and such, where there's a very strong Roman Catholic presence. And so the Roman Catholic Church has not suffered decline as much as we've seen it. I served St. Andrew's in Calgary for 13 years. Our original church building downtown is now owned by a Vietnamese Roman Catholic congregation with about 400 or 500 members. And so just Vietnamese Roman Catholics. But the dilemma for the immigrants is that those immigrants come with very strong faith that they maintain as part of their culture that they bring with them as well. And then the second and third generation are as impacted by our secular culture as ours. And so as Christians are. And so you can talk to people like Muslims who are also concerned that their children and their grandchildren no longer hold their faith. And so it's everyone is being affected by this. Any other takers? Okay. So I'm about halfway through.
Can I
Yes.
just ask one more question, Peter?
Sure.
Because I think it may amplify your point a little bit. Let's talk about the Presbyterian Church in Canada, which has a significant Korean component now.
Yeah.
And what would our numbers look like if it wasn't for that community?
Yeah. The last time I looked at it, the Korean portion of our membership was about 25%. So yeah, it's pretty significant. And they come with a very strong sense of faith. you are not going to get me up to do a Bible study at 5 o'clock in the morning before I go to work. So not uncommon for Koreans. So
Peter, a little bit of context from my executive meeting at Presbyterian. We have 14 active clergy and 33 congregations.
Yes.
Less than half of our congregations have an active clergy person. And so, and then the 14 of us are doing the work of 33 ministers in our presbytery.
Yep. Same thing here in Calgary McLeod. Peace River Presbytery, where there's, I think, in the way northwest Alberta, north of Alberta, British Columbia, I think there's 5 congregations, and the only minister serving up there is retiring. And so you look at Saskatchewan, in both presbyteries there, incredibly thin with clergy today. But I'll actually refer to that tangentially soon. I want to just do a very quick look at, the impact of this on our own denomination. And you can see from the statistics how we have been eroded by people who were part of our congregations who are simply slipped out of church involvement and then slipped out of the Christian faith. And also by the fact that our young people aren't staying. And, the average age of Presbyterian congregation goes up. And especially worrisome is the how quickly worship attendance, the total combined worship attendance of our congregations has been declining. So this is an impact of how society is changing. So the question is this our fault? And many people will say yes. Many people will say, we didn't do enough to help our kids, or whatever. And Joel Thiessen, that sociologist, says, stop blaming churches. Factors beyond what religious groups control significantly account for diminished religious involvement and affiliation. This is such a gigantic steamroller coming along, rolling over the church, that it is very challenging for us to deal with. So for those who raised children in a Christian household and had them go to church school and involved in youth group and such, the society that supported like me and the older generations in having this faith and holding it, that disappeared for our kids. And so it became like a David and Goliath kind of scenario in us trying to deal with this. Lauren Mead was one of the most respected commentators, consultants on the nature of the church for about half a century. And he wrote a very important book in 1991 called Once and Future Church. And in it, and he talks about this shift. And just 2 paragraphs I want to read from that book from 30 years ago. 30 years ago, he wrote, the dilemma of the church in this transitional time is that the shells of the old structure still surround us, even though many of them no longer work. Our task is no less than a reinvention of the church. It may take several generations. We will not see the end of it, but we must begin now. We are at the front edge of the greatest transformation of the church that has occurred in 1,600 years. So that's going back to the Reformation. It is by far the greatest change that the church has ever experienced in North America. It may eventually make the transformation of the Reformation look like a ripple on a pond. Really, really strong words. When the book came out in 91, that, lots of clergy were reading it and talking about it. And it created quite a hoopla for about a year, and then everyone forgot it. But looking back on these statements now, 30 years later, it is so easy to see the truth in this because we're experiencing this. Okay, going back to Jonah. Part of Jonah's struggle was God's desire for Jonah to reinvent himself. That's what God was really needing Jonah to do. Jonah was being asked to change from someone who wanted Assyrians punished to become a missionary concerned for the heart of Assyrians. So God was wanting him to become a strategy as God was pursuing God's mission in the world, a strategy to foster change in Nineveh. Now, I've been using this phrase a lot, and I wonder if you have thought about the church in these kind of terms, that we are God's strategy for affecting God's mission in the world, that we're to be in the business of influencing the world to become what God would have the world be. Throughout the Bible, God's mission has not changed. God has simply added new strategies. The children of Abraham, the Israelites, were a strategy. They were blessed to be a blessing in the world. Old Testament prophets were there to keep nudging the Israelites back on course to fulfill this role in being the strategy in the world. The story of Jonah ends up in Scripture as a reminder that they have this role in the world. And eventually to this, God adds a strategy in sending the Son of God. And then the Son of God adds a strategy in sending the Holy Spirit. And then the work of Jesus Christ and the work of the Spirit forms the next strategy, which is the church. So we are a strategy of God. And as Jonah was being called to go to Assyria, so we are being called to go into the world for the tikkun olam, for the repair of the world, to help the world come to know and love God and to learn new ways to live with one another. So, quick recap. My question: is this the time when God is directly or indirectly challenging the church to rethink its very nature? The church is a strategy that God uses to change the world. And it's a strategy that's been successful for like 1,600 years. But society has changed so much, so fast, that the way we've been doing that strategy no longer works. That's what we're talking about next. And the consequence is the church is in decline, not only numerically, but we're declining in our effectiveness as God's strategy. So the implication is that we need to rethink what the church is about. Now, I just want to pause there and see if there's any questions and comments. I hear none. There'll be time at the end as well. So how was it that we were an effective strategy? The old setting for us It's called Christendom. So 1600 years. And in Western society, certainly, you have this Christian kind of culture that dovetails with the life of the church. I took this picture in Florence of the Duomo this fall. I'm very proud of this photo, got to tell you. That's actually 15 different pictures taken with a telephoto lens, all glued together to make one image. That's why it's so sharp. But this really represents, this is a massive, massive church. And this kind of represents the prominence and the power of this Christian faith at the very beginning of, or before, during the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. But this is the kind of world that we had, that we call Christendom. And in a Christian society, where everyone's Christian, what you really needed were small pockets of Christians that we call congregations, where people can be known and know others, where we have a place to grow in faith and have that faith sustained, where we can care for each other. So you need smaller communities in this Christian society. And this was a highly successful model for the church for hundreds and hundreds of years, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries is especially true. And there were always people looking for a faith community to be a part of. And so they were sustained generation after generation. And so this is called what we lived with was an attractional model of church. And it's what we still live with today in many ways. And we as Presbyterians have been doing it, for the most part, passive attractional model. It's based on the premise that all the callings of church are being fulfilled within a congregation's life. There's this assumption that people will always come to church in a Christian society. So all you have to do is maintain a congregational life. You will fulfill all the purposes of God, and then people will come and the church will be sustained generation after generation. You didn't have to do anything to make that happen. Just keep the church running. It was passive. Since 1958, people have been dropping out of church. A growing portion of people have got no interest in the Christian faith. And so that pool of people who are looking to be a part of a congregation actually, for the first time, starts to get small. In reaction, around 1970, the church growth movement is born. And they recognize that and something that was, articulated in 1963, that people went church shopping when they were looking for churches. They had their own shopping list in their head of what they were looking for in a church. And as a consequence, because we were developing this consumer mindset when it came to the churches we wanted to be a part of, the church growth movement says, well, that means you have to orient your church and its life in order to make the church more appealing and to have the church meet needs. And if you can be the best church in your neighborhood, the best church in your community at meeting needs and meeting preferences, then you're going to grow. And so again, it's recognizing there's this consumer mindset and orienting church life to it. And those churches that could do that did very well. In the 1990s, I was a part of Oak Ridge Church in London for a decade. Did it very, very well there. One year we had over 100 people become members in a single year. And when I left, there was about 150 kids in church school. I was the associate minister. I was one of two ministers there. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, you could do this with a shrinking pool of people looking for church. if you were actively trying to make your church attractive, you can grab a chunk of those people. So this was the active attractional model. And here, slide. So the premise is still, for the active model, all the callings of the church are being fulfilled within congregational life. The assumption is people will come to our church if we meet their needs and preferences. And so the goal becomes maintain a best in the city attractive congregational life. And that worked really, really well for about 3 decades. And but in about the year 2000, the church growth people began to see that those practices were starting to lose steam, that they were becoming less and less effective. Why? The pool of people out there looking for a church is getting smaller and smaller and smaller still. And so even for the church growth congregations, this is now not working for them. Today in Canada, if your congregation is one of the 100 largest churches in the country, you can still make this work, and they are still making it work. But basically everyone else, regardless of denomination, are having a struggle. The irony of this is that by 2000, we've had 40 years of decline in mainline church particularly. And then that started to awaken mainline churches like Presbyterians that maybe there are things these other denominations and congregations are doing that are attracting people. What is that? And what should we be doing? And we started to wake up generally to this just at the moment when the church growth movement was becoming less and less effective. So we kind of missed, for most churches, mainline churches, they missed the boat on that. But still, even today, many Presbyterians will look at, whatever big church they know and say, what is it they're doing we can do? And it's because we all want the magic bullet. But the church growth people today will say that they don't even have the magic bullet. So both versions of the attractional church model, active and passive, are really, really in decline. And because the pool of people looking for church is now so tiny. Both those models are still rooted in that sense of Christendom, that there's always people in society with a Christian background who's looking for a church. And but Christendom is gone. So really it comes down to today, the strategic question that a congregation is asking, whether it's overt or tacit, subconscious. But congregations today are asking one of two questions. The majority of Presbyterian congregations, their question is, how do we cope? How do we cope with this, what changing society is doing to us? And so every year, these congregations that are trying to cope and are trimming the budget because the income's not there, reducing the number of things that they do because they have fewer able volunteers to do the work. They are deferring maintenance on their buildings because they can't afford to do it. A growing number of our congregations have no church school at all. And or reduce the hours of paid staff. So we go from a full-time staff to full-time minister to part-time minister to no minister. Harken back to Alton's comment about the presbytery and how many congregations no longer have clergy because they've shrunk to the point where they can afford it. And so these are congregations that have chosen the strategic question, how do we cope? And they try to cope by managing the decline, but trying to maintain the church as it was. 60 years of experience has shown us that a focus on maintaining does not maintain. And congregations that simply focus on maintaining decline. The other strategic question a minority of congregations are asking, but a growing number are asking is, how do we evolve? If we are a church now in a secular society, not Christendom, if the pool of people who are just naturally looking for churches is so tiny now that we can't rely on replacement, just walking in the door, then how do we evolve to be God's strategy in our society as God pursues God's mission in the world? And I think when we put in those kind of terms, a lot of congregations would actually say, we would like to be God's effective strategy in the world. And that's what New Beginnings is here to help you do, is to think about, how do we evolve? Move beyond just how do we cope, but how do we evolve? So how are these churches evolving? How am I doing for time? Good. So how are these churches evolving? There's an emerging sense of church. And part of it is churches that are going inward and churches that are going outward. This is the last section for tonight. So churches going inward. In 2015, Angus Reid, that has a lot of interest in the expression of religion in Canada because of the person Angus Reid and his interests. So they found in 2015 that 40% of Canadians, which includes those who belong to a church and those who have no religion, found that 40% would be classified as spiritual but not religious. And so about 40% of Canadians claim to have some kind of spiritual interest, some kind of spiritual need for spiritual meaning in their lives. And so some churches are really exploring the depth of that. In Calgary here, we have Friends Church, and they're independent, and they call themselves, their basic metaphor for their own life is, we are a spiritual gym. You go to the health club, the workout with your, pumping iron, and you come here to this church to strengthen your soul. And I went there once for worship, and the topic was, how to do journaling. And this is the sermon topic. How to do journaling? How can that help you in your spiritual life? Right now, the sermon series that they're starting off the year with, taken right off their website, starting January 2nd, we are going to explore the traditions of scheduled spiritual practices to develop your own personal spiritual practices that will help you connect with something more, capital M. Not specifically talking about God, but this is a Christian congregation that really has made fuzzy the edge of the church, the boundaries of the church, to make room for those who have spiritual need but don't connect as you and I do as Christians. It goes on, These will be daily, weekly, and monthly practices that have stood the test of time and can help each of us find deeper sense of spirituality in our everyday life if we are willing to reach for them. So this is a congregation whose primary focus is helping you go deeper into God. Oak Ridge Church, where I served, they called as an associate minister, a Presbyterian minister, woman who taught in a program for spiritual directors. They taught spiritual direction and they certified spiritual directors, and they called her as a minister to the church. And one of the things that she did was she taught and built a group of 10 members who were trained spiritual directors who could help individuals in their own walk of faith. There's a movement there's a movement called New Monasticism, and it's about realizing that we live as smaller pools of Christians in a secular world, much like what the monastic movement was like in the Dark Ages. And so these are people who live a common life, but just don't live it in the same monastery anymore. And it involves them in working away at their inner life, their spiritual connection with God, being a witness in the world. And some of these churches, they have a regular habit of prayer. And so everyone stops at these set times during the day and prays. And the congregation provides them with written prayers for those set times. And so in theory, everyone in the congregation, like in the monasteries of old, everyone in the congregation stops at certain hours of the day and prays together wherever they are. But they are together in that moment of prayer, praying the very same prayer. And these congregations are, taught prayer, contemplation of God, understanding how work can be a spiritual practice, making rest a spiritual practice, finding, putting yourself on your own individual personal spiritual retreats, discovering, what Buddhism can do to inform our Christianity and our spirituality, what the Desert Fathers, the monastics who lived in Egypt in the desert in like the 4th century, 5th century AD, what they had by way of spiritual practices. What can we learn from them for ourselves? And so this is a growing idea. Anglicans in Canada are embracing this more. And if you're becoming a minister studying for the ministry in the Anglican Church, you can actually take a course in this as part of your studies now. So that idea of going inward and is one of the two emerging strong trends. Other one, our congregations are going outward, missional congregations. This is the current strategic plan of the Presbyterian Church in Canada would like to see more of our congregations adopt a missional orientation. And I think from my limited experience, this is more appealing to Presbyterians than the going inward way. But missional congregations understand that they are sent. They're not called to be communities of faith to gather primarily, but they are gathering to equip themselves to be sent. And these congregations are not like the attractional model churches, which is focusing church life primarily on what happens inside, but they are becoming more externally focused. They're trying to figure out, how do we love our neighbor and how to act on it. They realize that Christianity, in its willingness to help others, becomes evidence for the existence of God. And so this is that going outward sense is also part of that strategy of God. And so in our world today, in the Church of England started something called Fresh Expressions, which is doing this. And they now have 3,000 congregations worldwide involved in their Fresh Expressions movement. They do, dinner church, where people just show up on a Wednesday night with their kids, and whoever's there first starts cooking dinner, and in the church kitchen, and people pile in, and someone looks after kids, and someone else is cooking, and then they sit down, and over a meal they talk. They have a scripture lesson. They talk about the passage, and then at the end of the meal, they take bread from the table and wine from the table, and they have communion. Pub church, church board for skaters, skateboarders, things like that. 1001 Worshiping Communities is a movement in the Presbyterian Church USA. Since 2012, they have formed 677 missional churches, and of which 20% didn't survive, but 80% of those 677 congregations have. And 41% of those congregations work with the poor or the homeless, 15% with children or youth, 11% focused on immigrants and refugees, 9% on justice issues generally. A number of them have become what's called earth care congregations. My favorite one that I read about is just south of me in Montana. The faith community is it revolves around a working farm. The faith community owns the farm. They volunteer their time to raise produce on the farm, and then they sell the produce at cost in the city for the working poor. A couple of specific examples. I got the time. A couple of specific examples. I was at St. Andrew's in Calgary for 13 years, and we grew into being a missional congregation. And we called it Mission Within a Mile, which sounds a lot nicer than Mission Within 1.6 kilometers. And so we always looked for ways to make a difference in the neighborhood. We looked at census data, discovered that 9% of the households in our neighborhood were single parent families. And so we started to adopt single parent families, and we had 3 adopted families, and that whenever there's any kind of need that we can help with, we just did it. If a baby was coming, we would just raise money and buy cribs and diapers and everything and outfit them for a baby. That kind of thing. Discovered a house that was owned by the government. A community house for people with disabilities. And the deck on the back of the house was a wreck. And so we went to Home Depot, got a donation of the wood, 2 days, slapped a new deck on the back of the house. Within our mile was a low cost of housing, apartment building for families who are at risk of being homeless. We got very involved there. My wife and a friend would go in and teach art programs for the kids. One of our members would go in and help people learn how to budget and manage their money. Worst day of my life was digging post holes in the backyard of the apartment building for a new fence. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of rocks under Calgary. So finding ways of doing that. I did an interim ministry at Varsity Acres Church in Calgary. And this is a congregation that's highly involved with immigrants, and we just stepped up our involvement there, and ran ourselves, 2 English second language courses, sponsoring refugees, and becoming, as a consequence, becoming a real multi-ethnic congregation, as some of these people we were working with decided to stay with us. We also, just before COVID hit, unfortunately, we started a conversation. We provided the leadership, to get together people in our neighborhood, administrators from 2 public schools, reps from 4 different congregations, the director of the community association, the social worker, city social worker for our neighborhood, the local city councilor for our area and his executive assistant, a couple of city services, public health nurse, and put 24 of these people in the same room and talked about what do we see as the needs in our neighborhood from our different silos, and then proposed that could we meet some of these needs if we start working collaboratively. And all but one of those 24 people wanted to do more work on that. And then COVID hit, and everything collapsed. But I understand that's been regenerated now. But trying to varsity as an older age congregation, saying like we can provide leadership and we can make things happen if we just get people beyond our church involved. And the very first thing we tried was get the neighborhood involved with cleaning up the neighborhood in the spring once the snow melted, which was a cool exercise. So there's a Missional Church Calgary, last example. They don't have a pastor, about 60 at worship, 1/3 of them age 12 and under. They meet every other week for worship, every other Sunday, but the backbone is their small group activity weekly. And the main focus of the small group was to help each other in the group figure out how to touch the lives and help the neighbors in a 10-house block around their own home. They said, this is our mission field, is the 10 houses around every one of our families. And the small group focus was, how do we help each other be able to be that missionary in their neighborhood? So, given that our current model of church, the attractional model, is terminally broken and no longer works, we are called to kind of reframe, I think, how we understand church. So many congregations are anxious, depressed, demoralized, because they're continue to pursue a model of church that hasn't worked in 60 years. It's working less and less effectively over 60 years. And a growing number of congregations are starting to say, we have to evolve, not just maintain. And we're in the business of tikkun olam. So tonight is the beginning of like 6-7 week process, which is your own personal belly of the whale time for your congregation. It's a time to reflect on the mission of God. We are here to help others love God and love neighbor, and like Jonah, to consider how we may be called as a congregation to partner with God as God's pursuing God's strategy in your community. And like Jonah, churches today, it is a struggle to change our attitudes so we can get on board with this. 30 years ago, Warren Mead asserted, our task is no less than the reinvention of the church. It may take several generations. We, this generation, will not see the end of it, but we must begin now. And so you commence the New Beginning program, and which is your opportunity to sit in the belly of the whale. So starting Sunday, you've got groups meeting, and they'll be meeting online because of COVID, 4 weeks. And the first night you'll receive a copy of the assessment of your congregation that was prepared as part of this program. 3 weeks are reflecting on what's in that package, what your community of Midland looks like, and what are the strengths and orientations of your own congregation. With the 4th week looking at, so what do we do? What do we think? How do we evolve? And the facilitators of these groups will combine what they've heard into a single report. That report goes in according to the program. That report goes to the congregation at a meeting where everyone's in the room. We'll see what that looks like. And it's not a meeting to decide anything. It's just feedback. So everyone hears what the group said, and to get more feedback from the congregation. And it all goes to the session for the session to consider and develop. And they keep the congregation involved. And my role after this weekend is to provide some support for these house group meetings and in the preparation of that report, and then month by month in 2022, in about 6 sessions, to help you keep working well ahead on the goal. So that's what you're all about. Any comments or questions here at the end? This is your time. Any surprises, any ahas, any whatever?
Please do take advantage of this, folks. It's a great opportunity to ask any questions you might have.
Peter.
Yes.
Ross Kirkby here. Yeah. You've obviously studied a lot of things in doing this work you've been doing. And we talked about mainline churches, but the evangelical side of things isn't shrinking the same, is it? And so my question is, in your studies, have you found things that they're doing that would fit with the Presbyterian church that we could do?
So something in the recorded sermon for Sunday is the evangelical church overall is declining. The Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada has been experiencing intermittent decline since 1980. Mormons who go knocking on doors are in decline in North America. The fastest declining denomination in North America is the Southern Baptist Church, the denomination of Billy Graham. The only, generally, the big box churches, mega churches are generally evangelical, although two of the very largest churches in Canada are Korean congregations of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, but generally evangelical brand churches. The third largest congregation in Calgary, Westside Kings, which was started by the Pentecostal Assemblies. It is the staffer in charge of youth ministry there. He says that the model of congregation they have is not sustainable for this decade. And the sixth largest congregation in Calgary, Foothills Alliance, their senior pastor just recognizes that they have totally flatlined by way of membership, and they are, and so those are the two of the largest ones that I'm aware of in this city. So this is affecting everybody. So
okay.
Peter, the
Albert.
churches that have followed the New Beginnings program, and you've been involved in a number of them, but overall, has it made a big difference in the way they operate and are now more working on God's plan.
Yeah. So the program's American, and there's been several hundred congregations go through it there. And it makes the impact on congregation varies. In our denomination, we started doing this about a year before COVID, and then COVID put a big hole in what we were doing. And it really depends on a congregation. The first one I worked with, I did this weekend, and we trained up the house group leaders, and 2 weeks later, they decided to kill it because people in the congregation were really not willing to change. But we do have some congregations who have jumped on board this and are utilizing it to really rethink what they're doing. But a lot is dependent on the strength of a congregation and its willingness to wander outside the box. You are two things. Your congregation is a nice sized congregation to be doing this. The smallest church I've dealt with this with had 18 members and adherents. So not much by way of resources. But you've got a good sized congregation for this. And just dealing with the leadership that I've seen in my first few engagements with Knox Church has excited me because you seem to have some energy and impulse to do something. And that is fabulous. So I'm very hopeful for you folk. Rebecca, no.
Yes.
Okay.
I was just waiting to see if anyone else was going to talk because I know there's a lot of people on here. I just wanted to say I appreciated your presentation. I think one of your slides ended up answering the question that I initially asked. This is really just a comment. I'm not going to be asking any questions, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
But, this is coming from a lay person. I'm not really a person who's attended church my whole life. I was born Roman Catholic and was in the Roman Catholic Church when I was young. So my general feeling in terms of what you've presented and what I've observed is, church has, in my experience, in not Knox Church, because I love Knox Church, but it has focused on dogma and shame. And people don't want that. People don't want to come somewhere to feel bad. And, I think right now in the world, addiction, social media, depression, mental health, it is all a search for God. And so I actually think the world is just absolutely ripe for church, but it's how that church is going to be presented and how that church is going to reach out to people. And, Jesus didn't go around condemning people. He went around loving people and healing people. And I feel that, with these examples, there's so many creative ways for us as a body of people who love God and love people to go out and do something to attract. It's like attraction rather than promotion, So I think it's a very exciting time. It's a very exciting time for this church. This is a very exciting program. And I think what our talks and what you presented tonight is a great springboard to create a vision of something that will be really potent and really it would just be very exciting, and people will want to be a part of it and instead of trying to make people be a part of it, So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you are absolutely spot on. Your Roman Catholicism is showing, but but it's that sense of kind of really even reimagining church. So 2 quick examples of that here in the city. I did a study on large churches here in Calgary in 2005. The 10th largest congregation in the city by way of worship attendance was Central United church. Huh. Right downtown, old Methodist stone building, no parking in Calgary, where we have the second most expensive downtown parking of any city in North America, number 2 to New York. And this church with no parking, where you have to pay at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, you have to pay to park down there, booming. Why? They got to the end of their tether and decided that, as their minister said, we would rather go out with a bang than a whimper. And they said, how do we meet? How do we serve the neighborhood? What are the needs in the neighborhood? They said, well, we're a downtown church. We have a lot of homeless people who are addicts. And so they started AA. They started all sorts of programs that way. They created an evening worship service built on the model of recovery that used the 12-step program as the liturgy of the worship service. And they created a jazz band that they called the Cracked Pots, and to lead the music. And their Sunday night worship service became the first worship service in the world to be an official AA meeting. And they were getting twice as many people coming to the evening service on a Sunday night, where it is black as blazes out there and 25 below in February, and then twice as many than coming on Sunday morning. And then they, and so total rethink of what they're about. Their building looks a shambles, but they're putting all their effort into, what they do in the neighborhood. 2 of the biggest social agencies, nonprofit social agencies in the city, were started by Central. Have you ever heard of something called In From the Cold, where churches bring in homeless families and put them up for a night and give them breakfast and a bag lunch for the next day? Central United invented that. So reinventing church. Evangelical side, the booming church in this city is Commons Church, which they decided that they were going to become a liberal evangelical congregation, socially liberal. And it's a congregation that's attracted an immense number of disaffected young adult evangelicals who just can't abide traditional conservative evangelical church. And they are just going to beat the band. They've got 2 campuses now. But the way they've talked about church is that classically evangelical say, you have to believe this, and this. That's our box. And to be a part of our church, you have to accept that and be inside the box. And they said, we don't have a box. We believe in Jesus. Everything else is flexible. And so it is on fire, rethinking church. Questions or comments? Is that Juanita?
Sorry, I clicked the button, but it didn't work initially. I really appreciated what you had to say about the group of community leaders getting together and discussing what needs there are across the community. As information came out about the residential schools, and in our area there is an Indigenous population. It broke my heart over and over to think of people who see the church as as their enemy, and we don't know how to reconnect and show that we've always wanted to love you. This, we have to admit what happened, and not with the truth and reconciliation. But I'm really excited by the idea of partnering with a number of people in the community to visibly show that our faith is real. It's not just a way of controlling or harming people.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to heal the world, the Tikkun Olam, as you said.
Yes, Tikkun Olam. The yeah, you have when I was growing up in public school in Guelph, Ontario, I think 3 times we jumped on a bus and went to visit Midland, to St. Marie among the Hurons. And so I know about your neighbors. You're an interesting situation there like us. I personally live 6 minutes walk from a reserve. And so, and the church I'm attending as a member now, I'm attending St. Andrew's Church, and they're trying very hard to build relationships with our Indigenous neighbors. And we have one elder who's been very, very helpful in our connection with their community. So it's been good. So yeah, that may be part of what you do.
Peter, can I go back to a comment that you made about
That's right.
the success of the church? Yeah, I think you referred to the last 2 centuries and
Christendom.
The success of Christendom. And one of the things that begs is a definition of success.
Mm-hmm.
And I think historically, in the Christendom model, success has been warm bodies, or
right.
at least some sign of, the odd breath being taken.
Yeah.
They don't have to be warm, Fred. We'll take them anyway.
Well, I just wonder if part of this process isn't redefining what success means.
Absolutely. Like absolutely, because the attractional model, success was measured by head count. And so, and then especially when the church growth movement happened, that became doubly so. Like I started a congregation north of Victoria in the late 80s, and head count for me in my job, for my boss, head count was everything. And I had a schedule that I had to be on to make, to get a church to a certain size and into a building and financially viable on a schedule. And so that's how we did New Church. And it was all predicated, and it cost an absolute gazillion dollars, because like I was paid by the national church. My salary was paid by the national church. The national church spent $500,000 buying our church property, and then the congregation spent $750,000 putting up the building. And like that takes people. We're involved now in the Presbyterian Church with an organization called Cyclical for forming new congregations. And these are congregations that are never going to be concerned about head count. They are, the large majority of them will not ever have a building. They may never have an ordained minister. And so they're not being driven by budgets that have to sustain all these expenses that our usual congregations do. And so and the other thing about headcount, frankly, is the model of church that a lot of mainline people have, Presbyterians for sure, is, a church is a gathered congregation in its own building that is served by its preacher. And as resources go down, they cut back on the hours of the preacher. We'll have half-time minister and share a minister with 3 other churches. And then they'll let go of the minister. And then as the numbers go down, they get to the point where they say, we can't afford the building. And if we can't have the building, we can't be a church. And so we have to close as a congregation because we can't have a building. And I have never read any of that in the gospel. And so, and there's plenty of congregations like here in Calgary, Sun West Church. They had 1,000 at worship before they even started talking about maybe having a building. 1,000 at worship. And so, so it's the things that have driven us by way of numbers and such is because we have a sense of what church should be, and we have to have enough bums in the pews, as we say, to make sure that we can afford the budget that make those things happen, and which is kind of backwards. And so the reinvention of church can change all that. Yes, Tony, turn your mic on. Oh, there he is. There he goes. Hi.
Thanks of all. First of all, like Rebecca said, follow it up. What an excellent presentation. Thank you for giving up your time with us. You are so knowledgeable. So thank you for that.
I'm so old, I got to tell you.
I do have a couple things I just wanted to ask, and it
Sure.
ties right in with what you just said with bums in the seats. So here's my thing. Way back at Trinity Trinity Church in Oro, Highway 11 and Line 7, I remember being a member, being on session and thinking every night, why is this building not open when it's like tonight, -20? I'm just pulling an even figure. Oh, we can't bus people in and we have no one to watch them. And I wasn't even able to do it either because I had 2 young kids, but it really weighed on me as I went to bed. So, number 2, I like your analogy of getting close to home of everyone and the 1 kilometer away or the 1 mile away. So the single parent, of course, if I had a business, I would hire them. The special needs, I agree. The addict, the ex-convict that wants to go straight, yep. And the person in poverty, cool, love it. Let's bring them in. But how sustainable is that? Like, it's lovely to have them, but then where's the offerings? And believe me, I'm not I have an MBA, but I'm not the MBA type. I'm just a plain guy. So where's the offerings? And then could that possibly, by people that are traditional attending members, look at who's there and they're like, I don't want any part of this. So number one, we're not getting any revenue. And I don't mean to sound cold-hearted. I'm just confused. And these people that were giving their 100 a week or whatever are leaving. I see like a vortex. And I don't mean that heartless, because I'm the first one to help the poorest person. I'm like Robin Hood is my guy. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, how does this figure in?
Yeah. So there's kind of 2 things I like to say in response. The first, the finance thing. It's very true. I can talk about Centennial Presbyterian Church, Northeast Calgary. They're a congregation that half of its membership now are immigrants from Africa, and they had some decades-long members who were people of color, predominantly from the Caribbean, part of the congregation, but they have in the last 15 years become a central focus for people from several different African countries. And it's not just so, and they tend to have very low paying jobs. And so they can't contribute financially. And their sense of church is different, that they don't have that sense of like volunteerism to participate in making the machinery of a congregation go. It's just not their heritage. And so the congregation is having, as an example, one church example, they are having some growing pains around that, for sure. But they're also doing something is just happening organically. That in a previous role that I had in the presbytery, I was encouraging them to actually start, consciously working, like proactively working at building what has just been happening naturally, and what could possibly happen. That said, we do have some, like, I'll keep with the African theme. We have a few African congregations that have been able to develop and find, and raise the resources and such, and build their own buildings and such. One in Montreal, one in Toronto in particular. So despite these limitations, so it can happen, but it's just on a different scale. But the other thing is that we can get so, but the other point is that we can get so tied to the need to have a certain infrastructure and to have a certain financial plan that requires certain income. And then that can become the driver, rather than say that the driver is, the ministry. And then we try to work the ministry within whatever limitations that you have. I mean, even when I was at St. Andrews, we had a $700,000 a year budget. We had limitations, and we have a 4% drop in income. We have to let a staffer go. So you can have, regardless of scale, you can have limitations. But if the focus is there, then that becomes, the problem. That becomes the mouth you have to feed, rather than say, we're about the ministry, and and we'll just work with the resources we got, and that's okay. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's it becomes a problem for congregations when their focus becomes too much on the resources, and that becomes the thing that yanks congregations around, rather than say what is the ministry we want, and then how do we pursue that with the resources we got. Rebecca.
Yeah. Are churches able to apply for funding if they're doing some sort of hybrid program? Like, I'm thinking of Salvation Army. They have halfway houses, they have addiction centers, they have shelters, and I'm wondering, are they getting funding from the government because they're also, doing a public service? Like, is that part of people's funding model?
So I actually can't answer that question for you. Certainly in the United States, that's becoming more and more of a thing, where the government's funding church operations that are providing social services. And that's in a country with very, very strict idea of the separation of church and state. I suspect people like the Salvation Army get grants, There are, I think, certainly in Calgary, we've had more success with churches starting things and then spinning them off as nonprofits, which allows them to get the funding to do things. And so, like the number one social service in the city is the Mustard Seed, and which continues to be overtly a Christian organization, but it is a nonprofit. The Dream Center, Coutts, which was started by Central United, also very prominent, and but they continue to be Christian organizations that are run as independent nonprofits. Another emerging way to do this is called social entrepreneurship, which is developing, doing some kind of social initiative to help, and doing it in a way that is income generating, and it doesn't necessarily have to be as a nonprofit. But a Presbyterian elder at Grace Church here in Calgary, he literally wrote, the Dummies book on social entrepreneurship, and so we've got a resource here in the author. He's a sociology prof, but that's another route that you can go, but our experience here in the city is spinning them off into independent nonprofit societies, and then they certainly do get funding, to whether it's, we created the Calgary Homeless Foundation. We have 80 congregations in the city that are helping to purchase apartment buildings to create low-cost housing for people who are at risk of homelessness. And so we've got, I think, 5 now, but it's 80 congregations help make that happen, but it's a nonprofit organization that's able to get a grant. So that we found that helpful here.
I think we're coming to the end of our time. Do we have one more quick question for Peter? And if not, I'm sure nobody will complain, as it's Friday night at 9 o'clock.
There you go. I thank you for your attention, and thank you for your compliments. I'm working with the house group leaders tomorrow, day workshop training. And then because I'm coming to you virtually with a pre-recorded sermon that's more focused on the missional church aspect of as a direction, because that's what the New Beginnings program promotes and what the Presbyterian Church in Canada promotes. So you'll be hearing more about that on Sunday. And you'll be hearing about my favorite missional congregation. I haven't talked about them at all, but they are just outside Calgary. They are astounding what they do. So you hear their story on Sunday.
Thank you very much. And Alton will be transferring you $1,000 out of his account. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Alton.
You're welcome.
I'm paid by the Presbyterian Church in Canada for this, so there you go.
Well,
grants. I just want to say, if you want to do another source of grants, Presbyterian Church in Canada is the Avon Bloom Fund, or Avalon Bloom Fund. It used to be called the Experimental Fund, and it's got a new name. But if you really are going to do something different, you can apply it to them for a grant. And they are all about churches doing experiments. So that's a source that I've gone after once myself. So
I want to thank you so much, Peter, for helping us with this. It would have been so cool to see you in person. I think we would have really had a great time, especially with that Q&A, to see you in person.
Yeah.
But we're adapting to our changing surroundings. For those of you who are not in house groups but want to be, make sure you talk to either Al or Marilyn Turner, because they're coordinating those groups. So speak to those folks. It's going to be a very powerful time, and you'll have a direct hand in shaping the future of Knox Midland. So I'd really encourage you to do that if you can. And of course, we'll be in contact with everybody about upcoming meetings and that kind of stuff. But the next thing on the agenda is getting those house groups started and getting some conversation. I want to thank you all for sticking around with us. We had 28 participants at one point, which I thought was fantastic. And that's just cameras, 28 cameras. Obviously, there's many people who are more than one person behind the camera. So thank you for a tremendous turnout. This will be recording, and I will upload it as well. So you can pass this along to anybody if you find it to be of interest.
Good. Well, have a good night. I'm now off to dinner.
Enjoy dinner.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.